The sun is not up yet. The world is quiet. Only the hum of a heater or the whisper of a fan breaks the silence. For many people, this is the hour for sleep. But for a very small group of people in law enforcement, this is the hour for work. When a high-risk inmate must move to ADX Florence, the job starts early and it starts very quietly. ADX Florence is a place built to hold the most dangerous inmates in the federal system. It is a fortress of concrete and steel. Getting an inmate there is not a normal trip. It is a mission. It takes plans, people, checks, and steady hands. This is the story of that trip, the careful steps, the long list of checks, the quiet that surrounds every move. It begins long before anyone opens a door. The first step is a paper file. Clerks and officers read the file. They check the inmate's history. They look at behavior, health, and risks. They read about past escapes, threats, fights, and health problems. This work is not fast. It is slow and careful. People who do this work need to be exact. One missing note could make a big difference. After the file is ready, the Bureau of Prisons and the U.S. Marshals talk. They are different agencies, but they must work together. The Marshals run the big, long trips. They fly prisoners on the Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, called JPATS, and they drive them on secure ground teams. The Bureau of Prisons decides that the inmate needs to be at ADX. The Marshals decide how best to move them. A plan is made. The plan is written down. The plan is short and clear. It lists the people needed. It lists the vehicle or plane. It lists the medical needs. It lists the route. It lists the backup plans, just in case. This planning can take days or weeks, depending on how risky the inmate is. The more risk, the more careful the plan. On the day before the move, a small team meets. They are quiet. They do not want the inmate to be nervous. They do not want the public to be worried. They go over the plan one more time. Who will drive? Who will ride in the van? How many guards will travel? Is a plane needed? Are doctors needed? They check every box. The inmate does not know the day until the move day. This is by design. If an inmate knew ahead of time, they could try to make trouble. By keeping the time secret, the marshals and prison staff make the trip safer. When morning comes, the team wakes early. They do not shout. They move in quiet. Staff at the sending prison prepare. They do a medical check. A nurse or doctor looks the inmate over. They make sure the inmate can travel. If the person is sick, they might cancel the trip or call a doctor to travel with them. Health checks are serious. Air travel, for example, may need extra health papers. Next comes the restraints. The marshals and prison staff use restraints to keep everyone safe. In public rules, these restraints are described clearly. Handcuffs, a waist chain, also called a belly chain, and leg irons are used. The handcuffs are double locked. This means they are locked so they do not tighten by accident. These restraints are not for pain. They are to stop sudden moves that could hurt someone or let someone run. The staff checks the restraints. They check that they are not too tight. They check that the inmate can breathe fine. The officers are careful. They do not want to hurt the inmate. They want to move them safely. The walk from the cell to the transport point is slow and quiet. Doors open and close in order. Each door is locked behind them. Cameras watch. The officers use short, clear radio messages. They do not talk more than they need to. The path inside the sending prison is planned so other inmates do not meet the person being moved. This keeps the trip calm and safe. If the move is by vehicle, the inmate is walked to an armored van or a secure transport bus. These vehicles are strong and built to protect everyone inside. They have reinforced sides and special seats. Inside, there are bars or partitions to separate people. Officers check the vehicle before they load anyone. They make sure the seat belts work. They make sure the doors lock. They have extra handcuffs and other tools ready if they are needed. If the move is by air, JPATS is used. JPATS flies prisoners on special flights. These planes are set up so prisoners can travel safely. The flights have space for several prisoners and many officers. Medical staff are sometimes on the plane. JPATS has hubs where planes land and other planes take over, so the trip can cover long distances with careful changes. Before the van or plane starts, officers do one more check. They check the inmate's name, number, and paperwork. They check property, what the inmate carries, like legal papers, letters, or small items. Everything is counted and listed. This is called chain of custody. Everything that moves with the inmate is noted so no one can say it was lost. Then the vehicle begins to move. On the road, the trip is quiet but tense. Officers watch mirrors. They look for cars that come too close. They watch the people they pass. Drivers are trained for this. They know how to keep a steady speed, how to avoid trouble, and how to use the best roads. If they need to change the road, they do so quickly. Marshals have backup plans in case something unexpected happens. If the trip is by plane, loading is quick and done in a way that keeps prisoners separated. Officers walk them onto the plane in small groups. Seats are checked. Restraints stay on. Flight crews know the rules for prisoner transport. Medical checks might be done again. During flight, officers monitor everyone, check seat belts, and make sure the trip is calm. During any transport, officers also watch the inmate for signs of trouble, medical problems, stress, or behavior that could cause danger. If a person looks sick, staff can stop and get them medical help. The marshals and BOP do not want anyone hurt. When the vehicle or plane reaches the destination, the arrival is controlled like the leaving. Officers check the paperwork again. The receiving prison or facility staff meet them at a secure point. Property is handed over and counted. The inmate is walked through a series of doors until they reach the intake area. At intake, staff at the receiving place do their own checks. This includes identity checks, medical checks, mental health screening, and a review of the inmate's file. They look for alerts, things that say the inmate is at a higher risk or needs special care. If the inmate is going to ADX Florence, officers at ADX make sure the person meets the rules for that prison. ADX is a special place with strict rules, so the final move must match their standards. All of this sounds like a list of steps, but each step carries weight. Each step must be correct. A mistake could mean a person gets hurt or that the trip fails. For this reason, the people who do these moves practice. They train. They review what went well and what can be better. After a big transfer, they sometimes hold a short meeting to see how the operation went. This is called an after-action review. There are public examples that show the scale of these moves. When the nation needed to move men like the Boston Marathon bomber or other very high-profile criminals, the Marshals and BOP used aircraft, armored vehicles, and many officers. News stories reported on heavy security and closed roads for some of these moves. These stories show how serious the work can be. Still, much of the detail is not for the public. That secrecy helps keep the trip safe. But the public rules and public reports give us a clear picture of the steps and the care taken. There is also a human side to these trips. For the inmate, the transfer can be scary and stressful. One day they live in one place, and the next they are on a van or plane wearing restraints. They may have not eaten well or slept well. They may feel dizzy from the lights and noise. Officers are trained to be professional and to treat people with respect, even when those people have done bad things. Medical teams try to make sure the prisoner is safe. Counselors may be available if the person is highly stressed. For the officers, the job takes focus. They must do what is right and do it without emotion. Their aim is to protect the public, the inmate, and themselves. They wear heavy uniforms and carry radios. They practice their steps again and again until the actions are smooth. There is another small truth. These trips often look calm on the outside, but inside the officers are watching every second. They watch the inmates' hands, their eyes, their breathing. They listen to car engines and radio sounds. They track the clock. Time matters. The schedule is tightly kept. Being too slow, or too loud, or too visible can create risk. At the end of the trip, there is usually a sigh of relief. The inmate is handed over. Forms are signed. The transport vehicle is cleaned and checked. Officers take a moment to rest. They may not talk about the trip much. They do their work, they finish the job, and they get ready for the next one. When the inmate steps into ADX Florence, the real silence returns. ADX is quiet like a library on a winter morning. There are no crowds. There is no music. The world seems small there. The inmate will learn the rules of ADX and settle into the routines. For some, this is a place where they will be for a long time. This story shows one important thing. Moving a high-risk inmate is not about drama. It is not about chase scenes or loud fights. It is a slow, careful job done by trained people who follow steps and rules to keep everyone safe. The mission must work from start to finish. No one can guess at the route or the time. People do not take chances. The craziest part is not that the trip is dangerous. The craziest part is how calm it is. How many careful hands and quiet plans make a difficult thing look normal. That is the power of planning, and that is how a tough trip becomes safe. The road stretched ahead like a long gray ribbon. Morning light was still weak, barely touching the ground. The van moved at a steady speed, not too fast, not too slow. Inside the van, the air felt tight and still. The officers sat straight, watching the mirrors and the road. They did not talk much. They saved their voices for short, clear radio calls. The inmates sat in the back, fully restrained. The seat belt was locked. The cuffs and chains were double-locked. The metal felt cold on the skin. The inmate could not scratch an itch or rub tired eyes. This is how the rules are written. High-risk moves must be safe above all else. The van had strong windows that did not open. There was a divider between the officers and the inmate. Even inside this small space, it felt like two different worlds. The inmates sat in silence, trying to breathe slowly. The officers stayed alert, their eyes moving from the mirrors to the road and back again. They passed houses, fields, gas stations, and empty lots without stopping. Every stop increases risk, so the marshals plan routes that avoid stops. Fuel is prepared ahead of time. Brakes are timed. Drivers switch only at secure spots. Outside the van, the world looked normal. People walked dogs. A man carried a cup of coffee. Kids waited for school buses. No one knew that inside the passing van sat someone on their way to ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the United States. Inside the van, every second mattered. The lead officer listened for updates from the command center. Sometimes a soft beep came through the radio. A coded message. A weather update. A reminder about a planned turn ahead. The officer answered with short words. Copy. Receive. Turning now. The inmate looked through the reinforced glass at the passing shapes. Cars moved like shadows. Trees shook in the wind. The inmate had no idea how long the trip would take. Half an hour? 3 hours? All they knew was that the world outside was getting farther and farther from the life they once knew. Every move to ADX begins with the unknown. For many inmates, this trip is the last time they see the world without walls. The van finally reached a highway. The officers relaxed just a little, but not much. Highways are good because they are smooth and wide. But they are also open, and open roads always bring risk. The officers planned what lanes to use, what exits to avoid, and where to expect traffic. Sometimes a second vehicle followed behind. This is not always used, but when risk is high, more officers are added. The second vehicle keeps distance and watches for danger. Its job is simple: protect the van in front. The inmate shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable. But restraints are not made for comfort. The chains kept the hands low. The belt across the chest stayed firm. The legs had little room to move. This is how all high-risk transports are done. Following rules meant to keep everyone safe and prevent sudden actions. The inmate thought about where they were going. Some people call ADX the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Some call it the Supermax. Some call it the place no one leaves. ADX Florence is known for extreme security and long hours alone in cells. For many inmates, this trip feels like the last step in a long fall. But the officers in the van did not think about that. Their job wasn't to judge or punish. Their job was to transport safely. They had a mission: get the inmate from point A to point B with no harm. They focused on that mission with all their attention. Hours passed. The officers kept their eyes sharp. They watched the speed of cars behind them. They looked for drivers who got too close. They checked for anything unusual: a car following too long, a sudden slowdown, a strange sound. They had seen many things in their line of work. They knew how fast a quiet morning could turn into something unexpected. At one point, a small red car drove up behind the van and stayed close. Too close. The officer in the passenger seat noticed it right away. "Tail car?" he asked quietly. The driver checked the mirror. Maybe. Could be nothing. A few seconds passed. The red car stayed too close. The officer looked again. "Let's adjust." The driver eased the van into another lane. Not fast, not sharp, just a smooth change. The red car stayed behind for a few more seconds, then drifted off into the next lane, took an exit, and disappeared. The officers took a slow breath. "Just someone in a hurry," the passenger said. "Maybe," the driver answered. And they moved on. This kind of thing happens often, not because people are chasing the van, but because drivers behave unpredictably. Officers must judge every movement, every car, every choice. They cannot assume anything is safe. They also cannot assume anything is dangerous. They must stay balanced, alert, but calm. Inside the van, the inmate could not see what the officers saw. They only felt the small changes in direction and acceleration. Sometimes the van slowed slightly. Sometimes it sped up. Sometimes it switched lanes. All these movements were part of a plan invisible to the person in the back. After a long time, the first part of the journey came to an end. The van slowed down as it approached a secure checkpoint, a place selected ahead of time. It was not a gas station or a store. It was a safe, controlled area used only by law enforcement. Another team of marshals waited there. They had checked the area earlier. They stood near their own vehicles, ready to support the transport. The van door opened only after the officers checked every angle. The air outside was cold and dry. The inmate blinked at the sudden change in light. The lead officer spoke calmly. "We're transferring you to the next stage." The inmate didn't answer. The chains rattled lightly as they were helped out of the van. The officers held the inmate by the arms, guiding them carefully. They walked to a second van. The second van was also strong, reinforced, and inspected. Sometimes officers switch vehicles during a long move to balance driving duties or match the route plan. The inmate sat back down. The officers checked restraints again. They had done this many times already, but they checked again anyway. Safety depends on checks. "Secure," one officer said. "Secure," answered another. The door locked. The ride continued. On the second leg of the journey, the roads felt different. There were fewer cars, more open land, more distance between towns and houses. The world looked wide and empty. Far away, mountains rose like gray walls against the sky. The officer in the passenger seat saw them first. "South Range," he said softly. "Yeah," the driver replied. Getting close. The inmate couldn't see the mountains yet, but the officers could feel the shift. Once the mountains appear, the path to ADX Florence becomes clearer. Another hour passed. Then the terrain changed. The land stretched out in every direction. The air was brighter, and the wind moved dust across the ground. This part of Colorado feels open and lonely. It is one reason ADX Florence was built here. Space adds safety. As the van approached the small city of Florence, the officers adjusted their radios. "All units, approaching final zone," the lead officer said. "Copy. Roads clear," another voice replied. The inmate lifted their head, trying to see something familiar. But there was nothing familiar here. Only open land, long roads, and the distant shapes of buildings with tall fences around them. Florence has several federal prisons. They sit close to one another. There is a medium security prison. There is a high security one. And then, beyond them, is the most secure one of all, ADX. The officers slowed as they passed the first prison. They were not stopping there. They continued down a long road that curved slightly left. Off in the distance, the inmates saw something: tall gray walls and towers. It looked more like a fortress than a prison. The van turned toward a gate. The gate was tall. It had cameras and lights. Even in daylight, the place looked serious. A guard station stood in front of the gate. Officers inside watched screens and monitors. They checked every vehicle, every identity, every reason for entering. The marshals lowered their windows. "Marshal transport, one inmate for ADX," the lead officer said, handing over the papers. The gate officer checked the documents. A camera scanned the faces of the marshals. Another camera scanned the inmate's face through the reinforced window. The officer nodded. "Proceed," he said. The gate opened slowly. It did not swing fast or wide. It moved like a heavy machine, slow, strong, final. The van drove inside. There were more gates, more fences, more layers. ADX is built so that no one passes too quickly. The trip from the first gate to the intake area can take several slow minutes. Every gate closes before the next one opens. It felt like descending step by step into the deepest part of the prison system. When the van reached the intake building, the officers stepped out. The air was cool and dry. The officers from ADX walked out to meet them. They looked calm, serious, and experienced. ADX intake staff do their own checks. They check identity again. They check paperwork again. They check restraints. They check for injuries or medical issues. Nothing is rushed. Everything is documented. The ADX officers opened the van door. The inmate blinked at the bright light and stepped out with help. The ground felt firm. The air was sharp. The building ahead of them was thick concrete with narrow windows. This was the end of the road for the transfer team. But for the inmate, it was the beginning of something else entirely. The marshals handed over the paperwork to the ADX staff. Property was counted again. Documents were signed. Transfer complete, one marshal said. Received, the ADX officer replied. The inmate was guided inside. The marshals watched as the doors closed behind the inmate, each door thicker than the last. For the transport team, the mission was done. They would return to their vehicles, debrief, and prepare for the next assignment. But inside ADX, the inmate's world was changing moment by moment. The intake process had only begun. Before the day ended, the inmate would learn the rules, face the silence, and take their first steps deeper into the Supermax. And the trip, the craziest, quietest, most controlled trip of all, was behind them. The heavy intake door shut behind the inmate with a deep, echoing thud. It was the kind of sound that didn't just fill the air, it stayed in the mind. Officers on both sides of the door waited for the locks to finish turning. The sound of metal sliding into place was slow, steady, and absolute. The inmates stood in a small hallway. The walls were made of smooth concrete. The lights were bright, but not warm. Nothing in ADX was built to feel cozy, soft, or friendly. This place was built for control. The officers guided the inmate forward, step by step. The chains on the inmate's ankles made a light clinking sound with every movement. The officers walked slowly, with practiced movements. Their calmness was not laziness. It was part of the safety rules. Moving too fast can lead to mistakes. ADX avoids mistakes at all costs. A door opened ahead. The inmate entered a room with a small desk and two officers behind it. This was the first stage of the intake process, identification and verification. Even though the marshals had already confirmed everything many times, ADX staff do it again themselves. Name, one officer said. The inmate answered. The officer checked a screen. Date of birth. The inmate spoke again. The officer nodded and typed. Then the officers looked over identification photos, fingerprints, and documents. Every detail had to match perfectly. ADX staff do not rush. They treat accuracy like the most important thing in the building, because it is. Another officer stepped closer. We will remove your transport restraints and replace them with facility restraints, he said. The inmate stood still as the officers unlocked the transport cuffs. These cuffs had traveled across states, highways, and checkpoints. But inside ADX, those outside restraints had no job anymore. The prisoner was not going anywhere now. The new restraints were put on, lighter but still secure. ADX officers follow a slow, exact routine. They check each lock twice. They stand on opposite sides of the inmate. Their hands move only when the other officer agrees. Once done, the officer said, secure. Another officer said, verified. This was how ADX worked, always in pairs, always careful. Next came the medical check. A nurse stepped forward. She wore gloves and held a small tablet. I'm going to check you for injuries and ask you a few questions, she said calmly. The inmate nodded. No weapons in the room. No sharp objects. Even the pen the nurse used had a soft plastic tip. ADX leaves nothing to chance. The nurse checked blood pressure, pulse, breathing, and the inmate's skin for signs of harm. Everything was logged. If an inmate enters with even a small injury, it must be recorded. Any pain? She asked. No, the inmate replied. Any medications you are supposed to take? The inmate answered each question. The nurse typed details into the tablet. Finally, she said, you're cleared. The officers thanked her, and she left through another secure door. Now came the briefing. A simple explanation of what would happen next. An ADX officer stood in front of the inmate. He was calm, not aggressive. His voice stayed clear and steady. You will now be processed into the facility, he said. This includes property review, showers, clothing issue, and placement in your unit. The inmate listened carefully. The officer continued. You must follow all commands. You must not speak unless spoken to. There is zero tolerance for disobedience. Do you understand? Yes, the inmate answered. The officer nodded. Good. Another set of doors opened. The officers guided the inmate into the next room, property check. There wasn't much property. Inmates arriving at ADX do not bring bags, personal items, or belongings. Almost everything is provided by the prison. But the officers still check the inmate's shoes, clothing, and anything that came with the transport paperwork. The officer looked through the documents. You will be issued standard clothing, he said. Your personal items will be restricted until review. In simple words, the inmate would start with almost nothing. Next came the shower area, but not the kind of shower most people imagine. It was a small space with steel walls, strong glass, and a locked door. Officers stayed on the outside, watching. The inmate stepped inside, removed clothing under supervision, and washed quickly. New clothing waited on a bench. A set of prison-issued pants, shirt, socks, underwear, and slip-on shoes. All in bland colors. No drawstrings. No metal parts. Nothing risky. When the inmate finished and put on the new clothing, officers returned to restraints. Hands out. The inmate placed hands through a small opening. The cuffs clicked shut. Turn. The cuffs on the ankles were secured too. Move, the officer said gently. The inmate followed. Now came the walk to the first ADX unit. The hallway had strong lights overhead. Cameras watched every angle. Doors were thick, reinforced, and spaced far apart. Every door opened only after the one behind it shut. Every lock sounded like a vault closing. The officers walked with the inmate down this long path, a path many inmates walk only once on their first day. At the end of the hallway, another team of ADX officers waited. They stood at attention. Their gloves were tight. Their eyes were steady. One officer stepped forward. You're being placed in the orientation range. The final stretch of the journey toward ADX Florence is only a few miles long, but for the inmate inside the transport van, it feels like the longest road in the world. At this point, they already know the truth. Every mile forward brings them closer to a place very few people ever leave. A place built to silence danger, silence chaos, and silence even the loudest human spirit. The van slows as it reaches the outskirts of Florence, Colorado. The town is quiet, small, and calm, almost nothing like the prisoners being driven toward it. Many locals call this whole area the Shadow Zone, because so many federal prisons sit here together. But ADX is the darkest shadow of all. Inside the van, the inmate now sits completely still. Even the bravest ones begin to shrink a little when they see the shape of the prison rising in the distance. ADX doesn't look like a normal prison. It looks like a giant block of concrete buried into a hill, with tall watchtowers standing like frozen guards around it. There is no shouting, no noise, no sign of movement, just a huge, cold structure that feels like it's staring back. As the van approaches the first security gate, U.S. Marshals step out. They move in a smooth, practiced line. Every step has a purpose. Every word is short and clear. This moment is the handoff from Marshals to the Bureau of Prisons. It must be perfect. A guard behind a thick glass window checks the paperwork, scans the inmate's ID, and verifies every detail: name, number, history, risk level, reason for transfer. Nothing is rushed. This is ADX, after all. Even if the outside world is in a hurry, ADX is never in a hurry. The first steel gate opens slowly, sliding sideways with a deep mechanical hum. The sound feels like the start of something final. The van drives forward to a second gate. It opens, then a third, a fourth. Each one traps the vehicle in a box of concrete until every gate behind it has fully closed. It feels mechanical, like the prison itself is swallowing whatever comes in. Once the van reaches the inner yard, Marshals open the doors. The inmate steps out, chained from wrists to waist, waist to ankles. Several prison officers stand ready. They don't look angry. They don't look friendly either. They look prepared, like they have already survived 1,000 dangerous days and are ready for one more. The inmate is taken through a short walkway and into the intake room. Cameras follow every movement. Officers remove the chains one lock at a time. Medical staff step forward. The inmate's body is checked. Questions are asked. Every answer is written down. Every scar, every bruise, every injury recorded. One officer explains the rules of ADX. But he speaks calmly, almost quietly, like someone describing a cold fact. You will spend around 23 hours a day alone. You will eat in your cell. You will shower in your cell. You will not move without restraints. You will follow directions the first time. If you respect the rules, you will be safe. If you don't, this prison will still control you. Nothing is said twice. From there, the inmate is led down a long hallway. The floors are clean. The walls are thick. Doors close behind them with heavy thuds that sound like final decisions. Each step brings them deeper into the world that only a few people have ever seen, the inside of a Supermax unit. Finally, they reach the cell. There is no mystery to it. No comfort. No softness. Just steel, concrete, a small desk, a fixed bed, and a window so narrow you can't see much more than a slice of sky. Once the inmate steps inside, the officer says 4 words: Welcome to your unit. The door closes. There is no echo. The concrete swallows every sound, every breath, every thought. For the inmate, the journey that began with armored cars, air fleets, and armed guards ends in a room barely bigger than a bathroom. A room where time moves slowly, where the mind becomes its own battlefield, and where every day is a reminder that ADX Florence is designed not just to hold someone, but to control every part of their life. Outside the cell, officers walk past without looking in. They have seen this scene too many times. A new arrival, a new silence, a new story that will now play out behind steel and concrete. Inside the cell, the inmate finally sits down. The walls feel too close. The air feels too still. The world feels too far away. This is the true end of the craziest trip, not the armored trucks, not the air transport, not the marshals, not the gates. The real ending is this: a man alone, a room that never changes, a prison built to remove everything except time. And time moves very slowly inside ADX Florence. This is Crime Source. Subscribe for more videos.